I am Dr. Kumar Shantanu, Associate Professor of Botany from Deshbandhu College, University of Delhi. Today we shall continue our journey into the world of archegoniates. In this series of lectures on various plant groups belonging to the group Archegoniaceae, we have come a very long way. We have covered various biological aspects of bryophytes. We have also discussed multiple facets in the life cycle of various species of pteridophytes. Today we are going to begin with a broad and very important group of archegoniates, that is Gymnosperms. Now, to begin with the introduction of Gymnosperms, let us have a recap of what we have learnt till now. So, by now in this entire series, you have already been aware of the facts that the entire plant kingdom, apart from the microbes, rest everything belongs to the group eukaryotes. Here in this dendrogram, you can see that the three most prominent lineages giving rise to prokaryotes, archaea, and then the largest one, that is eukaryotes. And among these eukaryotes, all the plants and animals are put together. When life was evolving, the first and the foremost pioneer on the land habit were bryophytes. Yes, those same bryophytes which we saw and we discussed in our series of archegoniates. Now, the gametophytic phase in the life of bryophytes were autotrophic and dominant, and that the sporophytes of bryophytes are partly or fully dependent on the gametophytes for support and food. So, when life started evolving and taken a transition from water body towards the terrestrial habit, the gametophytic phase was still the dominant phase in the entire life cycle. The gametophytic phase was autotrophic and it was nutritionally independent over the sporophytic generations. When we further move towards the evolutionary line, we could see that pteridophytes, the life cycle has taken a turn. In the life cycle of pteridophytes, now the sporophytic generation is the dominant part and gametophytic phase has taken a back seat. It is nutritionally dependent sometimes and sometimes nutritionally independent from the sporophytic generation. Now, moving into the series of development during the course of evolution came a larger group, and that group belonged to Gymnosperms. Even when we see towards pteridophytes, the pteridophytes, they represented most primitive group amongst the tracheophytes, that is the vascular plants. So, the evolution was taking place not only in terms of morphology, but also in terms of anatomy and in terms of physiology of plant. This evolution was only meant to make the plant adapted to a changing environment. It also ensured, this direction of evolution also ensured that all the metabolic activities, all the physiological activities, they are happening at a much efficient manner. And that is how, when plants moved from water habitat or aquatic habitat towards the terrestrial habitat, they gradually started developing conducting strands. During bryophytes, among the species of bryophytes, we do not see any such prominent development of conducting strands. But when we talk about pteridophytes, yes, they do have a very well developed conducting strands. Further moving towards the next more evolved group of plants, that is your gymnosperms. When we talk about gymnosperms, the sporophytic generation is more dominant, it is absolutely autotropic, and gametophytic generation is very short-lived and it is completely dependent upon the sporophytic generation. The conducting strands are much more developed. The conducting strands, they also serve the purpose of giving them the mechanical strength. When we talk about sporophytic generation, if you could see in pteridophytes, unlike bryophytes, the sporophytic phase in the life of a pteridophyte was absolutely independent, vascular, autotropic, and they started possessing true root, stem and leaves. And this trend continued in the next generation of gymnosperms also. You could very well see that in the case of pteridophytes, the roots were absolutely developed, stems were there, and a very well developed leaves were also present. Now, there was also a trend of evolution in terms of spores. In case of pteridophytes, when we look at the homosporous pteridophytes are the only land plants where the short-lived gametophytic phase in the life cycle lives independent of sporophytes, and they could be autotropic or saprophytic, or it could be mycorrhizal. So, we also see a trend of evolution in terms of size of spores. So, gradually the evolution took place from a homosporous habit towards a heterosporous habit. Heterospory also ensured that the gametophytes developing from these different sizes of spores, they were representing two different sexes. The smaller spore or the microspores gave rise to male gametophyte, whereas the larger spore gave rise to megagametophyte or female gametophyte. These habit of heterospory could be considered by many botanists as a precursor to seed habit. We will see that this trend has further enhanced, and this heterospory has set in very prominently in case of gymnosperms. When we talk about pteridophytes, the sporophyte giving rise to two different types of spores, the smaller spore giving rise to male gametophyte, whereas the larger spore giving rise to the female gametophyte, and then the sperm and egg cell fuses on their respective thallus, and finally the sporophyte is formed. So, this trend was further enhanced and more prominently evolved in the next group of plants, that is gymnosperms. The sex organ, that is Archegonia and Antheridia, in both bryophytes and pteridophytes are with the sterile covering, and that water is the medium for the transfer of flagellate male gametes to the archegonium. We shall see in our discussion throughout this coming lecture that in gymnosperm, this dependency of water for the fertilization has taken a back seat. Now, the antherozoids, they are directly transferred or they are directly sent to the near vicinity of female gametophyte or archegonia, and they do cover their entire distance with the help of a cellular structure called as pollen tube. So, gradually this dependency has also gone down. This also indicates that the efficiency towards cross fertilization or efficiency towards sexual reproduction has also enhanced as compared to pteridophytes and bryophytes when we talk about gymnosperms. When we talk about sex organs in ferns or the so-called pteridophytes, the male gametes are represented by antherozoids or the sperm cells, which are multiciliated, and they swim across the venter canal or the neck canal cell and reaches to the egg. Now this transfer of spermatozoids till archegonia, it is mediated by water. Now this dependency has gone down. Gradually they have become more or less independent of water as far as the fertilization is concerned. So now let us move on to that more highly evolved group of plants which we are going to call as gymnosperms. In case of gymnosperms, the group that bears archegonia on the massive non-photosynthetic female gametophyte enclosed within an ovule. This is the same group where the male gametophyte is represented by pollen grains, and they are relatively a few celled and they are transferred to ovules mainly through air. Just to show the transfer of these gametes with through air, this is a pictorial representation where we could see that the male gametes or male gametophytes are born within an enclosed structure called as microsporangium, and these microsporangium bear individual microspores. These individual microspores represent male gametophyte. These male gametophyte are also termed as pollen grains, which are few-celled structures. They reach up to female gametophyte with the help of air. So they are air pollinated, and after fertilization that entire process of seed zygote formation and seed formation takes place, and then the secondary sporophyte or the seedling gives rise to the sporophytic generation. So here the entire process of fertilization has taken a more efficient and more evolved nature. Siphonogamy is one particular process which we will encounter here in gymnosperms. Siphonogamy is nothing but the formation of pollen tubes, and through these pollen tubes the male gamete, that is the sperm cells or the spermatozoids, they are sent up to the egg cells. This siphonogamy also ensures direct deposition of male gametes in the vicinity of egg. And in gymnosperms we will also encounter naked uncovered ovules, and seeds are these naked uncovered ovules and seeds, these are the characteristics of gymnosperms. In fact, the term gymnosperm was given for the first time by Theophrastus. Theophrastus was a disciple of Aristotle. Theophrastus, as we all know, is also called as the father of the botany. So Theophrastus gave the term gymnosperm by combining two different words, that is gymnos, which means naked, and spermus, that means the seeds. So all those plant groups which have no covering over the ovule, or we can say they have naked seeds, they were all clubbed together and put into one group called as gymnosperms. As far as their commercial use or their importance is concerned, gymnosperms are in great demand for their timber or lumber, for their paper pulp, turpentine, resin, and so many different commercial purposes, etc. Let us talk about some interesting facts about Gymnosperm, those plants which belong to Gymnosperm. As a matter of fact, the tallest plant known so far, that is Sequoia dendron giganteum. Also we call them giant redwood, that belongs to the group Gymnosperm. It stands tall up to 110 meters. Whereas the smallest recorded Gymnosperm belongs to a group, a subgroup of Gymnosperm, that is cycad, and the name happens to be Zamia pygmea, which is very small and merely 3 to 4 centimeter tall. The German Sherman tree is in Sequoia National Park, USA, has the widest girth at 31 meters. So if you could see that amongst the Gymnosperm, we could find the tallest of all the plants ever known to the mankind, and very humongous and very huge girth also belongs to this particular group. Some of the Gymnosperms, such as Cycas, Ginkgo, they are so rare in their occurrence and distribution that they are sometimes referred to as living fossils. Primarily also because they have a very long fossil history, they have a very long evolutionary history, and during all these entire long time they have shown very less change in terms of their morphology, in terms of their physiology, and also in terms of their chromosome structures. The Gymnosperms are also the favorites of horticulturists because of their evergreen and attractive foliage. So we see the usage of different species of Gymnosperm very widely and very commonly used in landscaping, used in gardens and all. The seed plants, that is spermophytes, are generally divided into two groups, that is Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. It was Theophrastus who used the word Gymnosperms for the first time, and unlike Angiosperms, the ovules are completely exposed in Gymnosperms. The Gymnosperms comprise of only a very small portion of plant kingdom, and they are represented by only 70 genera and somewhere around 700 species. In spite of being represented by such a few members, they are distributed throughout the world, and on many mountainous areas they form a dominant part of the vegetation. This also indicates their adaptability towards any kind of environment on terrestrial habit. They are found in tropical areas also. Many of the species, they are very dominant in subtropical, and yes, of course, when we talk about alpine and subalpine zones on the terrestrial map, we do find many of the species of Gymnosperms dominating that entire landscape. As far as the group Gymnosperm is concerned, it has a long history which dates back at least 200 to 300 million years ago, and we can assess this time period based on the fossils which we have discovered or the fossils which we have unearthed during our history. Their long evolutionary history contains many examples of organisms that existed and flourished for some duration and then became extinct as a result of changes in climate, topography and biological competition. It was the time where there was a time when most of the terrestrial habit or landscape was dominated by Gymnosperms. Of all the living gymnosperms, Psychedelis and Ginkgoales have a long fossil history, and that is why they are aptly called as living fossils. Ginkgo biloba is the sole living member of the group Ginkgoales, and they exist in wild state only in certain mountains in southeast China. The cycads are also relics from the past, and they are confined to some areas in the tropics and subtropics. The cycadophytes, that means cycadoids and cycads, they were abundant during the Jurassic period of geological time scale, and it was during this time that the dinosaurs flourished. Hence, the cycads are also called as dinosaurs of the plant kingdom. So these are certain names which we have given out of their interesting nature and their long history and their evolutionary growth shared with some of the extinct groups of animal kingdoms also. Now let us talk about characteristic features of the group Gymnosperms in general. In Gymnosperms, the plants are sporophytes. They have true roots, stems and leaves. So morphologically, the plant which we see most commonly, they are sporophytic in nature, they are diploid in nature. The sporophytes, they happen to be large, perennial with active cambium producing secondary xylem. Now, if I could recall, in our previous lecture, we saw that in case of pteris, some of the species of pteris, they do show secondary growth. Now, here the secondary growth process has completely set in almost every species of Gymnosperms. As far as their conducting strand is concerned, most of the Gymnosperm, they lack xylem vessels except ephedra, welwitschia and netum. With the help of this diagram, we could see various habits of Gymnosperms. Sometimes we could see a very massive, huge woody tree. We also find Gymnosperms which are of very small height, hardly of 1 meter. This is welwitschia. We could also see unbranched stems of some of the Gymnosperm. This here represents cycas. This is thuja. This is juniperus. So we do encounter various different types of habits when we talk about Gymnosperms. Now, as far as the sporangia is concerned, the spore bearing structure, they are borne on sporophylls which together form the cones, and all forms happens to be heterosporous, and the two kinds of spores produced are male and female gametophytes. So we shall continue our discussion about the general characteristic features of Gymnosperm in our next lecture. I hope I have been able to give you a very broad spectrum idea of what are the common aspects of Gymnosperms which we are going to discuss in this entire series. Thank you so much for your listening.